The storm had blown in faster than anyone in Alder Creek expected. By late
What terrible thing
afternoon,
could
the
happen
sky
next
had
to
already
shock us
turned the
even
color
more?
of tarnished steel, thick clouds pressing low over the snow-swept valley like a lid closing over a pot. Caleb Hart knew what that meant. Born on this land and raised by a father who believed a rancher should be able to read the weather like God's own handwriting, Caleb recognized the unnatural stillness that always came before the worst kind of blizzard. That was why he found himself outside long after most men would have taken shelter. He moved steadily along the fence line of his western pasture, checking for weak posts or gaps that might let his cattle wander during the night. The cold cut at him like a knife through leather, stinging the exposed skin of his cheeks, freezing his breath in the air. Each exhale rose in a small cloud before being swallowed by the wind. Caleb tugged his scarf higher and pressed on. It wasn't the cold that troubled him, that he could handle. It was the nagging feeling in his gut that something was wrong, a sensation he couldn't shake. Perhaps it was the eerie quiet. No wolves howling, no wind shifting, not even the distant creak of trees bowing under the weight of ice. Everything felt held back as though the land itself was waiting. He paused, resting a hand on one fence post already glazed with frost. Above him, the sky pulsed with a strange, muted glow moonlight trying to seep through thick curtains of snow clouds. Caleb scanned the horizon. Nothing but white, stretching endlessly. The silence felt unnatural, and he frowned. Alder Creek winters were harsh, but this one was turning cruel. Frozen wells, sickness traveling from ranch to ranch, desperate families stacking firewood into crooked towers outside their doors. And then there was Jonas Pike, Caleb's nearest neighbor, a quiet, haunted man who'd retreated deeper into himself with every passing year. Jonas had been bedridden for weeks now, refusing visitors except for the doctor, who came back shaking his head every time. Maybe that was what weighed on Caleb's mind. Jonas had no kin nearby, no friends to look after him. Caleb passed the man's cabin on his way home each evening, always noticing the lack of smoke in the chimney, the dim light flickering through frost-covered windows. He had half a mind to check on him again tonight, storm or no storm. As the wind rose, tiny crystals of snow lashed against Caleb's coat. He pulled his hat lower and pushed forward. The last stretch of pasture gave way to the wooded path leading toward home. Tall pines formed dark silhouettes against the pale sky, their branches groaning under the storm's weight. The path narrowed, and the wind hissed through the trees in thin, whispering strands. That's when Caleb felt it, the shift. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Snowflakes burst into the air with a sudden fury, spiraling so thickly he could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature dropped sharply, stinging his lungs with every breath. Caleb swore under his breath. He quickened his pace, boots crunching through drifts that were growing deeper by the second. Halfway down the path, he paused again. He had heard something, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the settling of snow. But no, there it was again, a thin, muffled cry, a sound of pure desperation carried on the wind. Caleb's heart kicked hard. Someone was out here. He turned toward the tree line, the noise growing just a hair clearer, a whimper, barely human, threaded with pain and cold. Pushing through the brush, he moved toward the sound, squinting through the swirling snow. And then he saw the small shape crumpled beside a fallen log. A person, a woman, barely alive. For a heartbeat, Caleb didn't move. The sight before him hardly made sense. A woman, curled on her side in the snow like a discarded doll, her thin coat stiff with frost, her boots missing altogether. Snow had piled over her legs and shoulders as if trying to claim her, to finish the work the cold had already started. Only the faint rise and fall of her chest, so slight he thought at first he imagined it, proved she was still alive. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her. "Ma'am?" His voice was rough, swallowed by the storm before it traveled an inch. He brushed snow away from her face and nearly recoiled at how cold her skin felt, colder than the air, colder than ice. Her lips were blue. Her eyelids trembled with every breath she fought to take. She must have been out here for hours. Hell, Caleb muttered under his breath. Who left you out here? He looked around instinctively, expecting to see someone else's tracks, a fallen horse, any sign of another traveler, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded belongings, just endless, unbroken snow. The storm had covered whatever trail she might have left, burying her story under white silence. He turned his attention back to her. She was young, early 20s maybe. Delicate features that looked foreign, unlike the rough frontier faces he was used to. Her dark hair stuck to her cheeks, crusted with ice. Caleb pressed a finger gently against the side of her neck. A pulse flickered weakly beneath her skin. She's dying, he whispered to himself. The wind howled in answer, flinging more snow across her body as if trying to hide her again. There was no time to waste. Caleb scooped her into his arms, startled by how impossibly light she was. She didn't even stir. If she had been conscious before, the cold had stolen the last of her strength. He hoisted her against his chest, pulling his coat tighter around her, trying to share what little warmth he could. The trek back to his cabin felt twice as long as usual. The storm battered him from every direction, pushing him sideways, tearing at his hat and coat, forcing him to lean into the wind just to stay upright. Drifts swallowed his boots to the ankle, then the shin, then higher still. Every step felt like dragging both of them through wet cement. But he held her close, shielding her face against his chest. "Stay with me," he muttered, as if she could hear him. Just a little longer. The trail blurred into white chaos. Several times he slipped, dropping to one knee, tightening his grip to make sure she didn't fall. Each time he forced himself back up through sheer stubbornness. He didn't know who she was, where she belonged, or why she'd been alone out here, but he refused to let her die. The first sight of his cabin, a dark rectangle half buried in snow, hit him like a second wind. Almost there. He kicked the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning. Warm air, thick with the scent of burning pine, rushed out to meet him. Caleb carried her straight to the bed near the hearth, laying her down with more care than he'd shown any living soul in years. Her skin had lost almost all color. Her hands were stiff, frozen into claw-like shapes. Her eyelashes were frosted white. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't just exposure. This was the edge of death. He threw more logs onto the fire, lighting the room with a fierce orange glow, then grabbed blankets, heated stones, and the kettle of water simmering on the stove. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But tonight, that didn't matter. Tonight, he meant to fight the cold itself for her life. Caleb worked with the steady, methodical focus of a man who had saved frozen calves and half-dead ranch hands too many times to panic now. He stripped off the woman's soaked coat and snow-heavy dress, leaving on only enough to preserve her modesty, then wrapped her tightly in every blanket he owned. Heated stones lined her sides, and warm broth waited on the bedside table for the moment she could swallow. But her skin. God, her skin was like marble. He pressed his palm lightly against her cheek. Nothing. No warmth pushing back. No sign that her body was fighting. Only the smallest shiver. That tiny flicker of life snapped something in him. A determination he hadn't felt in years. Since his wife died. Since hope had felt like a foreign luxury. "You're not dying here," he told the unconscious woman. "Not in my house. Not tonight." He knelt beside the bed, rubbing circulation back into her hands, her arms, her collarbone, working carefully, gently. Every few minutes he checked her pulse. Still there. Barely, but there. She needed time and heat, and God's mercy. Caleb stood to fetch more blankets and noticed something he hadn't seen before, a corner of folded paper tucked into the lining of her coat, half frozen and stiff. He almost ignored it, but something about the shape, too neat, too deliberate, pulled at him. He dug it out and brought it close to the firelight. It was an envelope. The name, smeared slightly by melted snow, was written in careful cursive, to Mr. Jonas Pike, Alder Creek. Caleb's brows snapped together. Jonas Pike, his nearest neighbor? The man bedridden for weeks? The man who barely spoke to anyone? He opened the envelope with stiff fingers. Inside was a letter and a contract. The words hit him like a hammer. Mail order bride contract between Elena Markova and Jonas Pike. The details were unmistakable. A young woman from overseas. Passage paid for. Agreement of marriage. Her signature at the bottom. Caleb stared at the document, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. So the woman freezing in his bed had come here for Jonas. But Jonas had never said a word about sending for a bride. Not once in all their years as neighbors. Not in his delirious ramblings when the doctor visited. Not in the quiet conversations they occasionally had about cattle prices or broken fences. And Jonas, secretive, withdrawn Jonas, hadn't set foot out of his cabin in nearly a month. He could barely stand. How would he have met her? Or helped her? Or even known she made it into Alder Creek? A darker thought crept in next. Had Jonas sent her away? Had he rejected her? Turned her out into the storm? Caleb clenched the papers in his hand. The woman Elena, according to the signature, moaned softly, a strangled, broken sound that made him look sharply back at her. Her fingers twitched beneath the blankets. Her brows pinched in pain. She was fighting her way back. Caleb dropped the papers onto the small table beside the bed and bent toward her. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe. You're warm. You're not alone." Her lips parted as if trying to respond, but only a faint gasp emerged. Her eyes fluttered behind closed lids. When she stilled again, Caleb finally exhaled, rubbing a tired hand over his face. He had a dying neighbor up the road. He had a half-frozen bride meant for that neighbor lying unconscious in his bed. And he had a storm raging outside that cut them off from the world. Whatever had happened, it was no simple misunderstanding. Caleb looked at Elena one more time. Come morning, if she lived, he intended to get answers. But tonight, he would guard her life with everything he had. Morning came slowly, dragging pale gray light across the valley. The storm had quieted some time before dawn, leaving the world buried under a suffocating blanket of snow. Caleb woke in the chair beside his bed, his neck stiff, his legs numb, and his mind already on the unconscious woman he'd tended all night. Elena still breathed thin breaths, but stronger than before. Her cheeks held a faint blush now, a promise that her blood was warming. Relief loosened something tight inside Caleb's chest. But with relief came another responsibility. Jonas Pike. The name on the envelope gnawed at him like a persistent thorn. Jonas was sick, everyone knew that. But what kind of man sent for a bride, then left her to fight a deadly storm alone? It didn't sit right, not even with everything Caleb knew about Jonas's reclusive nature. Something was missing. Something in the story lay buried under silence and secrets. Caleb hesitated only long enough to stoke the fire, adjust the blankets, and leave a pot of warm broth by the hearth. He bundled himself against the cold, grabbed his lantern, and stepped into the brittle air outside. The world was bone-white and still. Even the sound of his steps was swallowed by the snow. Jonas's cabin sat a half-mile up the slope, slumped like an exhausted animal. Smoke trickled from the chimney, a thin thread, barely visible. Caleb quickened his pace. That little smoke meant one of two things. Jonas had managed to wake and stoke his own fire, or the fire was dying, just like he was. By the time Caleb reached the sagging front porch, his pulse was beating fast, more from dread than exertion. He pushed the door open. Heat greeted him, but the wrong kind of heat. The air was feverish, stale, and thick with the smell of sickness. Jonas lay slumped on his bed, blankets tangled around him. His skin was grayish, stretched thin over high cheekbones. Sweat dripped from his temple. His eyes, once sharp, suspicious things, barely cracked open when Caleb entered. "Caleb?" Jonas's voice rasped like sandpaper. "You shouldn't be alone." Caleb set the lantern down and moved closer. "You look worse than the last time I came." Jonas gave a weak, humorless smile. "Don't need you to tell me I'm dying. I can feel it. All the way in my bones." Caleb swallowed. "Then you need to hear something important." But Jonas coughed violently before Caleb could continue. When the fit passed, Jonas sagged back, trembling. Caleb took a breath. "A woman showed up last night, half dead in the snow. She had papers with your name on them. A contract." Jonas's eyes flickered fear, guilt, something else Caleb couldn't place. He didn't deny it. "You sent for her." Jonas nodded weakly, each move costing him strength. "I did. Months ago. I was lonely. Foolish. Thought maybe a wife might fill the empty space in this cabin." His eyes drifted around the room, hollow. "I didn't think she'd actually come." "You paid for her passage," Caleb said, voice hardening. "Women don't cross oceans for nothing." "I panicked," Jonas whispered, tears forming, "when she arrived 3 days ago. I saw her at the door, small, frightened, hopeful." He closed his eyes, shame twisting his face. "I'd already gotten worse. I knew I was dying. I didn't want to trap her here. Tie her life to a man with one foot in the grave." "So you turned her away?" Jonas's breath shuddered. I told her to go back. Told her I couldn't do it. Then the storm came." His voice cracked. "I didn't know she had nowhere else to go." Caleb felt the realization stab him. Jonas hadn't just rejected her, he'd sent her into danger. Jonas reached out a trembling hand, gripping Caleb's sleeve with surprising desperation. "Find her," he whispered. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just didn't want her chained to a dying man." Caleb nodded slowly, jaw tight. Jonas sagged back, exhausted. His breathing shallowed. Within minutes, his eyes drifted shut for the last time, peaceful, as though the confession had unburdened him. Caleb stood over the still form, heart heavy. Jonas Pike had made a tragic, cowardly mistake. But there was no undoing it now. What mattered was the woman alone in Caleb's cabin, a woman who had believed she was unwanted before she even stepped foot on American soil. Caleb clenched his hands. She wasn't alone anymore. Not while he was still breathing. By the time Caleb trudged back to his cabin, Jonas's confession weighed on him like a sack of stones. The cold had sharpened, the morning sun turning the snow into blinding sheets of silver, but nothing felt as harsh as the truth now living in his chest. He had found Jonas's abandoned bride freezing to death, because Jonas had sent her away, not with cruelty, but with fear. And fear could be just as deadly. When Caleb pushed open his cabin door, warmth rushed out like a welcoming breath. The fire burned strong now, its glow flickering across the walls. The room felt almost peaceful until he looked toward the bed. Elena was moving. Barely, but enough to stir the blankets. Enough to let him know she was climbing her way back from that white, silent edge. Caleb crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes still frosted at the tips. She was fighting to wake, struggling against exhaustion woven deep into her bones. "Easy now," Caleb said softly. "You're safe. You're inside. Just breathe." Her lips parted, a small sound escaping a gasp, or maybe a whisper. He leaned closer, listening. Her voice was airy, broken. "Cold, I know," he murmured, "but you're warming. You'll be all right." He pressed the back of his fingers to her cheek. Warm. Actually warm. A quiet triumph surged through him. He dragged cattle back from blizzards, rescued ranch hands who drunk themselves half to death in the snow, but saving her felt different, maybe because she had no one else. Maybe because she had crossed an ocean for a future that rejected her at the door. Maybe because she looked so impossibly fragile lying there in someone else's home. He lifted a spoon of warm broth. "Can you take a little?" Her cracked lips barely opened. He guided the spoon gently, letting just a trickle touch her tongue. She swallowed with effort, but she swallowed. "That's it," he encouraged. Bit by bit. She managed a few sips before her head lolled against the pillows again, exhausted. Caleb set the bowl aside. He studied her quietly. In the better light, she looked even younger than he'd first thought, no more than 22, maybe 23. Her hair, dark and heavy with melted snow, clung in waves around her face. Her wrists were delicate, her fingers slight. The kind of woman who would never survive frontier life alone. Jonas's bride. Caleb still couldn't wrap his mind around it. He fetched fresh blankets, layering them gently over her, making sure the stone stayed warm but not too hot. He worked slowly and carefully, as the one rough movement might shatter her. Hours passed like that, checking her pulse, rubbing warmth into her hands, coaxing her awake for a sip of water, then watching her drift into exhausted sleep again. Outside, the snow-muted world remained silent. Inside, the only sounds were the fire's crackle and Elena's fragile breaths. At midday she stirred again, her brows pinching. Her voice came out in barely their fragments, muddled by accent and cold. "Where?" "You're in my cabin," Caleb answered gently. "My name is Caleb Hart. I found you outside near the tree line." She frowned, trying to understand. Her lips trembled. "Jonas?" Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't know how much she even remembered. "Yes," he said slowly. "I know Jonas." Her eyes filled with something: fear, shame, hope? He couldn't tell. She tried to sit up. Pain shot across her features and she collapsed back. Caleb steadied her cautiously. "You need rest," he told her. "A lot of it. You were near frozen when I found you." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Then, in a trembling whisper, "Hey." "Told me go, Storm." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. So she did remember. Pieces, at least. When he opened them again, he spoke softly but firmly. "You're safe now." Jonas didn't understand what he was doing. "But he can't hurt you or turn you away ever again." He didn't say why. He didn't tell her Jonas was gone. Not yet. Not when she was barely clinging to life. Instead, he drew another blanket closer, settling it under her chin. "You're not alone," he said quietly. For the first time since he'd found her in the snow, her body relaxed just a little. Her eyes closed this time, not from exhaustion alone, but from a small, fragile sense of safety. A safety she'd never been given until now. By the next morning, a sliver of pale dawn seeped through the frosted window panes. Caleb had slept only in short stretches, waking every hour to check on Elena. Her pulse had steadied. Her breathing had deepened. Color had returned, faint but real, to her cheeks. She was still terribly weak, but alive. Caleb warmed more broth and sat at her bedside. When she stirred, he spoke gently. "Try a little more. It'll help." She obeyed this time with more strength, sipping slowly. After a few swallows, she let out a shaky sigh, her shoulders relaxing back onto the pillows. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, though exhaustion pulled at her eyes. A soft, awkward silence filled the space between them. Caleb wasn't a man used to conversation, certainly not with delicate, frightened women from across the sea. Yet there were things he needed to ask. Things she deserved to speak about. He cleared his throat. "Elena, can you tell me what happened? How you ended up outside in the storm?" Her eyes flicked toward him, wary, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to speak. But then she took a trembling breath and tried, "My English is not strong," she whispered, voice rough. "That's all right," Caleb said softly. "Take your time," she nodded. A long pause followed, as though she were assembling each word carefully in her mind before releasing it. "I come From small village, she began haltingly. Far, very poor. Her fingers twisted in the blanket. He could see how hard this was for her. My mother, sick. Medicine cost much. No money. Caleb felt a quiet ache in his chest. One man came, she continued. He say, women can write letters to America. To men who want bride, they pay for travel and we marry. Good life, work, safety. Her eyes shimmered with something fragile. Hope, Caleb breathed out slowly. He'd heard of such things, mail-order brides sent across the ocean with promises of security. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't, and you wrote to Jonas Pike, he said gently. Jonas, she whispered. He write kind letters, say he, lonely. Want wife. Promise I am safe. He send money, ticket for ship, for train. She looked down. Long travel. Very long. Caleb imagined the journey. A crowded steamship, weeks of seasickness, unfamiliar landscapes, unfamiliar language, then a rattling train across the wild American frontier. Alone, no friends, no guide. And when you arrived? He asked, already fearing the answer. Her lips pressed together, trembling. Her eyes glassed with hurt. He opened door, she whispered. Look at me, I smile. Say hello. A tear slid slowly down her cheek. He look, afraid, angry. He say, go away. Caleb's jaw tightened. He say he not want wife. Not now. Not ever. More tears fell. I try say I have no place. No money. He closed door. Caleb inhaled sharply, fighting the instinct to curse the man, even though Jonas was beyond hearing it now. So you left, Caleb said, voice low. She nodded. I walked to town, but storm, soon. Her breath hitched. I try find warm place. Barn, maybe. But snow, too deep. Wind very strong. Caleb remembered finding her small and silent in the white. She wiped her cheek with a shaking hand. I think I die there. Caleb reached out instinctively and covered her cold fingers with his much larger ones. She startled, then slowly relaxed her hand beneath his. You didn't die, he said quietly. You're here. And nothing that happened is your fault. She sniffed softly. I don't know what I do now. He didn't either, not yet. But he knew one thing for certain. After what she'd endured, he would not let the world toss her aside again. You rest, Caleb murmured. We'll figure everything else out when you're stronger. She stared at him for a long moment, studying him, searching for any flicker of rejection or judgment. Then she did something small, simple, and deeply telling. She let go of the blanket and allowed herself to lean just slightly toward him, trusting him, just a little. Caleb swallowed hard, feeling something shift inside him, quiet but undeniable. Elena Markova had been abandoned on the edge of the world, but as long as she was under his roof, she would never be abandoned again. Caleb had never heard the small cabin so quiet. No wind rattling the shutters, no coughing from the bedroom. Just the soft, fragile sound of a man who knew he was at the end. Jonas Pike looked smaller than Caleb remembered, sunken into the thin mattress, his skin paper pale, his eyes dimmed but not dull. There was still a sharpness in the way he studied Caleb and Elena, as if he were memorizing them. Elena stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame for balance. Caleb felt her tremble as he placed a steadying palm on her back. Jonas's cracked voice broke the silence first. So, you're alive. Elena took a shaky step forward. Barely, she whispered. But not because of you. Jonas closed his eyes for a long moment, the lines around them deepening. When he reopened them, something like shame flickered there. I thought you weren't coming, he rasped. Then when you did, I was too far gone to fix what I'd done. Caleb's jaw tensed. You left her in the storm, Jonas. She nearly froze solid on my land. Elena's chin trembled. She folded her arms tightly around herself, as though bracing for the truth she'd chased halfway across the world. Jonas tried to sit up, but the effort stole his breath. Caleb moved to help, but the older man shook his head. He wanted to speak the truth on his own terms. I didn't send her away. His voice was thin but clear. I sent for her months ago. Thought a new start, a wife. Maybe it'd give me something worth waking up for. He coughed, a deep, rattling cough that made Elena's face soften with unexpected concern. When the sickness hit, Jonas continued, I thought it was just a cold. By the time I realized it wasn't, I couldn't walk more than a few steps. Couldn't get to town. Couldn't send word. He swallowed painfully. Couldn't meet her stage. Couldn't warn her. Elena blinked rapidly, tears gathering but not falling. But someone met me, she whispered. The man who told me Jonas Pike sent his regrets and offered me a ride to town. He left me on the road halfway here. He said you didn't want me. Jonas's eyes hardened. Blackwell, Caleb stiffened. The foreman? I fired him. Jonas's voice grew harsh, bitter. Caught him stealing from my barns grain, tools, anything he could sell. He swore he'd make me regret it. I didn't think he'd drag a stranger into his spite. His gaze moved to Elena, something like grief there. I never wrote any message telling you to go away. Elena's hand rose to her mouth. She swayed, and Caleb instinctively steadied her again. Jonas looked at him with a weary, knowing expression. So she made it to your land. She collapsed on my boundary fence, Caleb said quietly. Another hour. She wouldn't have lived. Jonas's eyes closed again, and 2 tears escaped down his temples. The man had never cried in front of another soul, not even when his brother died. But now he did. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything she endured. For what my weakness caused. Elena stepped closer, her fear softening into something gentler. Why didn't you send the contract back? Or end the arrangement before I came? Jonas coughed again, this one weaker. Because I wanted to meet you. Even if I had nothing left to offer. He turned his head toward Caleb. She deserves better than a dying man. Better than a farm that won't survive the winter. His lips twitched into a thin, bitter smile. Maybe she already found better. Caleb felt something twist inside him, guilt, confusion, protectiveness. Elena looked between the 2 men, stunned. Jonas's voice faded. I won't be here long, but before I go, I needed you both to know the truth. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the storm had quieted at last. Inside the small cabin, the truth lay between them, heavy, painful, and changing everything that would come next. The calm that followed Jonas's confession didn't last long. A week passed, and Elena slowly regained strength. Her cheeks had color, her voice had substance, and for the first time, she moved around the cabin with more confidence. She even laughed quietly at Caleb's gruff jokes, though he tried to hide the warmth spreading through him. But the quiet was shattered one late afternoon by a rough knock at the cabin door. Caleb went cautiously, heart tightening. He opened it to reveal a tall, burly man in a worn coat. His face was weathered, but his eyes burned with a sharp, calculating cruelty. Are you Caleb Hart? The man demanded, his voice low and threatening. Yes, Caleb replied cautiously. Who's asking? The man stepped inside without waiting for an answer. I'm Victor Pike, brother of Jonas Pike, and you have something that belongs to me. Caleb's jaw tightened. I don't know what you mean. Jonas left nothing for me to give you. Victor's laugh was dark, humorless. Don't play innocent. That woman there, Elena Markova, she was meant for my brother. You've taken her in, you've interfered. Now you're going to answer for it. Elena stepped back, her hands trembling. She didn't take anything. I'm not anyone's property. Victor's eyes narrowed. Property? Maybe not. But she is the reason Jonas got anything, and I want what's mine. Or else. Caleb's hand rested near the doorframe, instinctively aware of the danger. He'd faced harsh weather, wild animals, and desperate ranch hands before, but this threat was personal. Victor's stance radiated aggression, the kind of reckless violence born from greed and entitlement. "You leave now," Caleb said firmly. "Or I'll make sure you regret staying." Victor's lips curled. "Is that a threat? You're a lone man in a cabin. She's just a girl. What can you do?" Caleb's gaze swept the cabin. Firewood stacked near the hearth, a heavy poker, a cast-iron skillet on the stove. Victor was big, but Caleb's resolve was bigger. Before Victor could react further, Caleb stepped forward. "I said leave." His voice was cold, unwavering. Victor sneered and reached into his coat. Caleb saw the glint of metal knife. Revolver? He didn't wait. A struggle erupted. Caleb pushed Victor back, slamming him against the wall with enough force to stun him momentarily. Victor regained his footing, swinging blindly. Caleb dodged and grabbed the nearest object, a thick iron poker, and planted it firmly in the ground between them. "You leave now," Caleb repeated. "This cabin isn't yours, and that woman isn't yours." Elena, trembling but determined, picked up a small metal pan from the stove. "I can help," she shouted. Victor paused, astonished by her courage. Caleb gave her a quick nod, signaling her to stay close but ready. The standoff lasted only seconds, but those seconds were enough. Victor realized Caleb was immovable, determined, and willing to fight for Elena. He swore under his breath, his eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, and with a last threatening glare, he stormed out into the snow. Caleb slammed the door shut, bolting it tightly. He leaned against it, chest heaving, sweat mingling with the cold. Elena's hand shook, and Caleb reached out, gripping hers firmly. "You're safe," he said quietly. "For now." Elena nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear and disbelief. "Why? Why would he come for me?" "Greed," Caleb said flatly. "And men like him think the world owes them something. But this is your life, not his." Elena's lips quivered. "And you risked yourself for me?" Caleb gave a small, awkward shrug. "Someone had to. And I won't let anyone hurt you." For the first time since she had crossed the ocean, Elena felt a strange, fragile sense of security. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Outside, the snow swirled again, gray and relentless, but inside the cabin, a quiet defiance had settled. Caleb had fought for her, and Elena knew now no one could chase her away without a fight. And neither would she let them. The tension in Alder Creek was palpable. Word had spread quickly about Victor Pike's threatening visit, and whispers ran through the town faster than the winter wind. Some townsfolk whispered that Elena was a fraud, an opportunist who had manipulated Caleb and Jonas. Others questioned Caleb, asking why he involved himself with a mail-order bride who didn't belong in the settlement. Caleb ignored them. He had spent years keeping to himself, avoiding gossip. But protecting Elena was no longer about privacy, it was about justice. He and Elena set out toward Jonas's cabin the next day, knowing that there was one last piece to uncover, the will. Caleb had remembered seeing Jonas scribbling on a pad days before his death. Something told him Jonas had left instructions for Elena, and if Victor Pike intended to claim anything, the document could settle the matter. The cabin door creaked as they entered. Caleb brushed aside the frost on the windows, and sunlight slanted across the room, highlighting the small wooden desk where Jonas had spent his final days. There, tucked under the edge of the desk, lay a folded parchment, sealed with Jonas's own hand. Caleb picked it up with reverence, carefully breaking the wax. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. As he read aloud, Elena's eyes widened with every word. "I, Jonas Pike, being of sound mind but failing body, leave all my belongings, including my cabin, my livestock, and my savings, to Elena Markova." She has endured what I could not prevent. May she find a safe home and a chance at a life I could not give. Let no one interfere." Elena's hands trembled. She whispered, barely audible, "For me?" Caleb nodded. Yes, every word. The revelation hit the town harder than any snowstorm could. When word reached Victor Pike, he stormed toward the cabin, face red and fists clenched. He barged inside, ready to demand the property, only to find Caleb standing firmly between him and Elena. "I see you got the letter," Caleb said calmly, holding the parchment like a shield. "This is Jonas's decision. You have no claim here." Victor lunged, but Caleb's resolve was unshakable. The room held its collective breath as Victor froze, realizing the stubborn, unmovable nature of Caleb's defense. There was no negotiation, no intimidation left. The townsfolk who had gathered outside to witness the confrontation murmured among themselves, astonished. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady. "This is my life. I will not be chased from it." Victor's jaw tightened, his hand shook. But the power of Jonas's will and Caleb's unwavering protection left him no choice. With a final glare, he stormed out, the snow swallowing his retreating figure. The town's shock didn't end there. At the meeting in the general store, the townsfolk listened as Caleb and Elena explained the events: the abandoned bride, the blizzard, Jonas's illness, and the malicious interference by Victor. Many faces, skeptical at first, softened as they realized the truth. The man they had whispered about, Jonas, had left everything to the woman they had doubted. And the quiet rancher, Caleb Hart, had risked himself to save her. It was the combination of unexpected inheritance, courageous intervention, and the morality of a man who acted purely out of honor that left everyone speechless. The townsfolk had expected scandal, manipulation, and tragedy. Instead, they witnessed an act of selfless courage and justice, guided by the wishes of a dying man who had finally tried to right his wrongs. Elena's eyes glistened as Caleb handed her the will. "It's yours," he said simply. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to," Caleb said, a rare, soft smile breaking his usually stoic expression. "You survived a storm, both outside and in life. That's enough for now." The town's shock slowly transformed into awe. Some even offered help, firewood, livestock, or food gifts, acknowledging not just her survival, but the strength and courage she had displayed. What truly shocked everyone wasn't just the inheritance, nor even Caleb's bravery. It was the quiet realization that life in Alder Creek, a place hardened by snow, isolation, and hard labor, could still hold unexpected acts of kindness, redemption, and human connection. For Elena, it was the start of a new chapter. For Caleb, it was a confirmation that sometimes doing the right thing could change more than one life. Sometimes it could change an entire town's perception of what it meant to care. And deep in the winter snow outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, justice, and the fragile beginnings of hope. Winter's grip on Alder Creek had begun to loosen. The snow still blanketed the valley, but the days were longer, the sun warmer, and the wind less relentless. Caleb's cabin, once a quiet refuge from the cold and solitude, had taken on a new life, one filled with cautious hope, small laughter, and a sense of belonging neither he nor Elena had expected. Elena moved with more confidence now, her steps steadier, her hands sure. She cared for the small garden Caleb had prepared near the cabin door, watered the livestock, and even began cooking meals that filled the cabin with smells unfamiliar to Caleb but comforting nonetheless. It was in the mundane routines, the daily rhythms of frontier life, that both found solace. Yet there was more than just survival at stake. Over the weeks, the bond between them had deepened, not as guardian and ward, but as two people learning to trust each other in a world that had so often been unkind. Caleb, reserved and stoic as always, found himself lingering by the doorway when Elena carried firewood, offering quiet smiles or subtle gestures of help. Elena, in turn, had grown to rely on his presence, the calm strength of a man who had fought for her life and chosen to stand by her despite the town's whispers. One evening, after a long day of tending to the livestock, Caleb and Elena sat near the hearth. The fire's glow painted their faces with warmth, the shadows dancing across the walls as the wind whispered softly outside. Caleb handed her a cup of steaming broth, and for a long moment they sat in companionable silence. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Caleb asked quietly. Elena looked into the fire, her dark eyes reflecting its flickering light. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only because I didn't know what I was walking into. I thought I was walking into a trap or into loneliness. I didn't know anyone could care like this." She gestured toward him. "Even you." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct praise. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said gruffly. "I did it because it was right. But it saved my life," Elena said softly, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "And not just physically. You gave me a chance to live a life I thought I'd never have." There was a pause, the kind that held both words and unspoken thoughts. Caleb looked into her eyes and saw not just gratitude, but something deeper: trust, hope, and the quiet flicker of affection. Outside, the last of the winter snow shimmered in the evening light, turning the landscape into a crystal world. For the first time in months, the world seemed alive rather than harsh. Inside the cabin, warmth wasn't just from the fire. It came from a bond forged in adversity, fear, and shared struggle. Over the next weeks, the town slowly accepted Elena. News of Jonas's will and Caleb's protection had spread, silencing most of the whispers. Some townsfolk even began offering assistance, helping her learn frontier ways: how to mend fences, tend animals, and prepare food from scratch. Elena's resilience and willingness to adapt inspired a quiet respect among the community. Caleb, for his part, found that life with Elena brought a subtle change in him. His days were no longer entirely solitary. He found himself laughing more easily, sharing moments he had long thought reserved for the dead or distant memories. Even when he worked the land, there was now a sense of purpose beyond survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the snow in hues of gold and amber, Elena turned to Caleb. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I want to face it with someone I can trust." Caleb's hand brushed hers, tentative but firm. "Neither did I," he admitted. "And maybe neither of us expected it. But here we are." The fire crackled, the wind whispered outside, and for the first time, both Caleb and Elena felt the weight of the past lift slightly. The snow, once a symbol of hardship and isolation, now reflected the promise of a new beginning. They didn't know what the future would bring: storms, hardships, or challenges, but they had each other, and that was enough. The frozen land around them had tested their strength, revealed their fears, and shown them the power of courage, trust, and compassion. In the quiet of the cabin, with snow stretching endlessly beyond the windows, Caleb and Elena began not just a new chapter in their lives, but a new life, one defined not by fear or abandonment, but by hope, care, and the fragile, unbreakable bond that had grown between them in the heart of the storm. Outside, Alder Creek lay silent under the snow. Inside, life and warmth had returned, and the story of a mail-order bride, a dying neighbor, and a solitary rancher had found its remarkable, unexpected ending.